The nightmare of Genghis Khan was not just written in blood on battlefields, it was carved into the flesh of women across continents. Imagine a dark tent filled with incense and fear, where trembling hands lie beneath silk sheets, waiting for a man whose very name would terrorize half the world. He was not only the greatest conqueror in history, but also the architect of a system of sexual cruelty so vast it reshaped civilizations. More than 7,000 women were catalogued, controlled, and violated under his command, their bodies turned into weapons of conquest. His shadow still lives in the DNA of over 16 million descendants today, proof of history's most horrifying sexual practices. But how did one man's personal wound transform into a machine of industrialized rape that scarred humanity forever? To understand, we must go back to the night when Genghis Khan was still just Temujin. Long before Genghis Khan became a name that thundered across Asia and Europe, he was simply Temujin, a young man trying to survive among the warring tribes of the Mongolian steppes. His story of domination through terror did not begin on the battlefield, but in the silence of a woman's captivity, an event so personal and so shattering that it would echo through every atrocity he later committed. In 1184, when Temujin was still an unknown tribal leader, he married Borte, a union arranged in youth to cement alliances and secure stability in a landscape where trust was scarce and betrayal common. For a brief moment, it seemed as though destiny had granted him a companion and a measure of peace. Yet peace never lasted long on the steppes, and the old enemies of his bloodline soon returned with vengeance in their eyes. The Merkits, remembering a blood debt owed by Temujin's father, struck his camp at dawn. Riders poured through the fragile defenses, weapons glinting in the morning light, and while Temujin fled on horseback, his new bride was left behind, taken as spoils by men who understood that a woman's body could be made into a weapon of humiliation. For 8 long months, Borte endured captivity at the hands of a Merkit warrior named Chilger. The chronicles written by later historians sanitize her suffering, leaving vague words that conceal unbearable truth, but the outcome tells us everything we need to know. When Temujin finally reclaimed his wife with the help of his blood brother Jamuka, Borte was visibly pregnant. The child she carried was named Jochi, his very name meaning guest, a cruel reminder of uncertain paternity. Though Temujin publicly claimed the boy, whispering doubts lingered. He would often look into Jochi's eyes, searching for Merkit features, haunted by the shame he felt every time he remembered fleeing on that fateful morning. This wound, half guilt, half fury, burrowed into his heart, shaping the man he would become. For a culture that believed a woman's honor was inseparable from her family's pride, Borte's violation was not only a personal tragedy, but a stain on Temujin's soul. He had saved her body, but not her dignity. Every sideways glance from his own people, every question about Jochi's bloodline, was like salt on an open wound. And in that wound, a darker Temujin was born. What followed was not mere revenge, but a transformation. The Merkits paid first. Temujin struck them with ruthless precision, not sparing women, children, or elders. Annihilation became his answer to humiliation, but the destruction of a tribe was not enough. He carried within him the need to inflict the same shame he had once suffered, to use women as instruments of vengeance. Borte's suffering became a template, replicated and magnified until it infected every conquest he led. From that moment forward, sexual violence was no longer a chaotic side effect of war, as it had been in countless other empires. Under Temujin, it became statecraft, a deliberate policy of terror and domination. By reducing women to spoils, he not only humiliated his enemies, but rewrote the very psychology of conquest. Where most warriors sought territory, tribute, or submission, Temujin sought something deeper, the obliteration of enemy honor through their women's wombs. The result was nothing less than the industrialization of rape, a system that turned private trauma into continental policy. Historians and psychologists alike recognize in this turning point the seeds of Genghis Khan's horrifying legacy. What might have remained the private sorrow of one man became a nightmare for millions. He could not kill his memories, so he killed entire tribes. He could not erase his wife's suffering, so he inflicted that same suffering across cultures. He could not undo 8 months of captivity, so he created lifetimes of captivity for others. In this transformation, the young man Temujin died. and in his place emerged Genghis Khan, the architect of an empire built not only on blood and steel, but also on the systematic violation of women. The cries that once haunted his nights became the chorus of an empire, a weapon sharper than any sword, ensuring that no people could forget the price of defying him. The destruction of the Merkits did not bring Temujin the closure he sought. Their annihilation could not erase the whispers surrounding Jochi's birth, nor silence the unending reminder that he had once failed to protect the woman he called wife. Instead, what began as revenge against one tribe hardened into a principle, a guiding policy that would come to define his empire. Temujin had discovered that terrorizing women meant terrorizing entire nations, for the humiliation inflicted upon mothers, daughters, and wives poisoned the spirit of entire communities. Where death silenced only bodies, sexual violence mutilated souls and left scars that lived for generations. The conquest of women became, in his mind, the most efficient form of conquest itself. From that realization onward, the Mongol horde no longer fought simply to kill or enslave, they fought to dominate the very bloodlines of those who opposed them. And as Temujin grew into Genghis Khan, his genius for organization transformed this philosophy of sexual vengeance into an institution as deliberate and methodical as his postal system or his military strategies. Accounts from contemporaries reveal how systematic this cruelty became. After each conquest, women were gathered in central courtyards, stripped of their ornaments and, more often than not, their clothing, while officials armed with wooden tablets circled like merchants at a marketplace. They recorded age, beauty, virginity, social rank, and even symmetry of features, reducing human dignity to numbers on a ledger. A virgin princess, perhaps from a Persian court or a Chinese noble house, might score in the 90s, earning her a place in the Khan's own collection. Lesser scores determined whether a woman was granted to a general, an officer, or to common soldiers. Below a certain threshold, she faced the most horrifying fate of all: assignment to the traveling brothels that marched alongside the Mongol armies, mobile prisons where bodies were consumed until they simply gave out. The bureaucracy was chilling in its precision, for every detail was noted and archived, ensuring that no woman was lost to the system. The Mongols could track not just cattle and horses across the steppes, but also the wombs they considered property of the state. This was not random brutality. It was the deliberate harnessing of sexual violence as both psychological warfare and biological conquest. By seizing women in this way, Genghis Khan understood he could shatter the pride of enemy men, erase aristocratic bloodlines, and ensure that future generations carried Mongol seed. It was warfare extended into the intimate, where victory was no longer confined to battlefield spoils, but inscribed into the very DNA of the conquered. The results are measurable even today, with modern geneticists confirming that nearly 8% of men across former Mongol territories bear markers of descent from Genghis Khan or his direct male relatives. Behind those statistics lies the horror of an empire where women were transformed into vessels of demographic engineering, their pregnancies serving as monuments to conquest. What made this system especially horrifying was not just its scale, but the cold efficiency with which it was administered. Soldiers and officers were rewarded with women as though they were coins of silver or horses, prizes distributed in recognition of loyalty and courage. The empire kept meticulous records, not only of numbers but of origins and assignments. Tangut maidens might be directed to one regiment, Russian captives to another, Persian girls to the households of favored generals. This cataloging created a grotesque racial map of exploitation, as if the Mongols were building a living museum of subjugated peoples, each ethnicity represented in the Khan's tent. Within this structure, women ceased to be individuals and became categories, assets, statistics, raw material for an empire that thrived on turning human suffering into statecraft. But beyond the ledgers and selections lay something even more insidious, the psychological theater of humiliation. The Mongols understood that to strip a woman naked in front of her community was to destroy not only her, but the spirit of her people. Mothers were forced to watch daughters evaluated, daughters to watch mothers parceled out, each generation broken before the other's eyes. This was conquest as spectacle, cruelty designed not just to satisfy but to terrify, not just to wound but to annihilate dignity itself. and through this theater, Genghis Khan's personal wound found its fullest expression. Unable to escape the humiliation of Borte's captivity, he forced the world to share it, magnifying one woman's suffering into a continental epidemic. What began with a single abduction evolved into a machine of sexual terror, operated with the precision of empire. It was in this stage of his life that Genghis Khan ceased to be merely a conqueror and became the orchestrator of history's most horrifying sexual practices, a man who converted private trauma into public policy and personal rage into the foundation of an imperial system that would scar humanity for centuries to come. As the Mongol conquests accelerated, what had once been a reaction born of personal trauma hardened into a system so vast and methodical that it could no longer be dismissed as barbarism. It was administration. It was policy. It was conquest elevated to a science of humiliation and reproduction. Where other empires plundered riches and enslaved bodies, the Mongols institutionalized the very act of violation, ensuring that every captured woman became part of a machinery designed to sustain the empire. The process was horrifying in its bureaucratic clarity. After each city fell, women were assembled in public squares as if they were livestock brought to market, their fates decided not by chance but by the rigid criteria of Mongol officials. Age, beauty, health, and social status determined placement within a hierarchy that stretched from the Khan's personal collection at the pinnacle down to the mobile brothels that trailed the army at its lowest rung. In these moments, human beings were not simply stripped of dignity, but transformed into entries on a ledger, the inkstrokes of clerks sealing lives into categories of exploitation. The scale of the enterprise was staggering. Surviving chronicles speak of thousands of women processed in days, each evaluated and assigned with the speed of an assembly line. High-born princesses were marked as gifts for Genghis Khan or his generals, their noble bloodlines appropriated into Mongol dominance. Women deemed suitable for officers or soldiers were parceled out as rewards, tokens of service that reinforced loyalty. Those who scored lowest, widows, the poor, or simply those judged insufficiently attractive, were dispatched to the military brothels, where endless cycles of abuse awaited them until body and spirit collapsed. The Mongols even distinguished between ethnicities, believing that Persian beauty carried one flavor, Chinese another, Russian yet another, as if cultures were wines to be sampled and consumed. This grotesque categorization underscored the depth of their cruelty, turning conquest into a carnival of degradation where entire civilizations were reduced to inventories of flesh. The logistics of sustaining such a system demanded infrastructure on a scale almost unimaginable. Entire detachments of guards were assigned not to protect armies or treasures, but to control the captured women. Supply lines ensured that clothing, food, and basic medical care reached them, not from compassion, but to maintain what the Mongols considered inventory quality. Administrators tracked pregnancies, recorded births, and documented deaths, producing archives that resembled commercial manifests more than accounts of human lives. Each entry represented a person reduced to a statistic, her suffering abstracted into the language of management. This bureaucratic banality was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the system. It demonstrated that for the Mongols, organized sexual violence was not an excess of war, but a deliberate pillar of governance, a structure as essential to empire as taxation or cavalry. Yet it was not merely physical control that the Mongols pursued. They understood that the destruction of an enemy required spiritual conquest as well. Women were often assaulted in front of fathers, husbands, or children, forcing men to witness their bloodlines humiliated and broken. Families were dismantled in calculated fashion, mothers torn from daughters, sisters separated forever, each fragment of kinship weaponized to deepen the wound of defeat. Even in death, the Mongols pursued symbolic annihilation, executing men of defeated tribes while compelling their women to bear Mongol children. In this way, whole populations were not simply conquered but genetically absorbed, their unique identities diluted and erased within a generation. Resistance itself was reshaped, for to fight the Mongols no longer meant risking death in battle alone. It meant exposing one's entire lineage to a fate worse than death, a legacy of dishonor carried through the bodies of women and the blood of future generations. The echoes of this machinery stretched far beyond the immediate victims. Entire communities began to collapse under the psychological weight of systematic sexual terror. Tribes learned that surrender might spare their cities from fire, but it would not spare their daughters from violation. The horrors spread like a shadow across Asia, whispered in taverns, recorded in chronicles, embedded into folklore as warnings for generations to come. The Mongols had perfected a new form of warfare, one in which sexual domination replaced the sword as the most effective weapon. And at the heart of it all stood Genghis Khan, the man who transformed personal humiliation into the architecture of empire, ensuring that his revenge against the world would be written not just in blood and ashes, but in the very flesh of humanity itself. By the early 13th century, what had begun as the vengeance of one wounded man had evolved into a calculated program of demographic transformation. The Mongol armies no longer marched merely to plunder wealth or topple thrones. They advanced with the deliberate intention of remaking entire populations at the biological level. Genghis Khan understood, in a crude yet terrifyingly effective way, the principles of heredity. He knew that the faces of children carried the marks of their fathers, that bloodlines preserved power across generations, and that if he could overwrite the lineage of an enemy through forced pregnancy, he could ensure that their defeat lived not just in memory, but in flesh. Thus conquest was measured not only by cities razed or treasures stolen, but by wombs captured, pregnancies monitored, and children born into a world where their very existence testified to Mongol domination. The machinery of this demographic conquest was immense. Women of noble birth were singled out with particular precision, for the destruction of an aristocratic bloodline was more than personal revenge. It was political theater. A Persian princess, a Russian noblewoman, or a Chinese court lady bore a symbolic weight far beyond her individual suffering. When her children carried the blood of Genghis Khan or his generals, it meant that dynasties which had once stood proudly independent now had their legacies consumed from within. This deliberate targeting of nobility ensured that power structures dissolved and that future rulers, wherever they emerged, carried the indelible stamp of Mongol seed. Entire courts became haunted by whispers that heirs were not truly their own, that every lineage had been tainted by the conqueror's hand. In this way, Genghis Khan destroyed not only kingdoms but the very idea of unbroken dynastic purity, leaving a scar that spread across political and cultural landscapes alike. Modern genetic studies confirm what the chronicles suggest. The scale of this biological campaign was without precedent. In regions once ruled by the Mongols, markers of Y chromosomes linked to Genghis Khan and his male descendants appear with staggering frequency, sometimes accounting for nearly 1/3 of the population. These numbers, often repeated as curiosities in popular science, are in fact monuments of atrocity. Genetic evidence of millions of forced unions carried out under the guise of imperial order. Every percentage point represents untold lives uprooted, every data point a reminder that conquest was written into DNA itself. What made this system so horrifying was that it converted human reproduction into an extension of war, transforming private violation into public strategy, and turning the most intimate act of creation into an instrument of cultural annihilation. The infrastructure to sustain this policy was as elaborate as any military campaign. Captured women who became pregnant were monitored carefully, not out of compassion but to ensure the health of the unborn. They were sometimes placed in separate camps, fed better rations, and watched by guards whose task was not merely to prevent escape, but to protect what the empire considered its future assets. Miscarriages were investigated, sometimes punished, as if women bore personal responsibility for failing to produce viable offspring. Newborns were swiftly categorized. Boys with signs of strength were absorbed into military training, destined to fight in the very armies that had destroyed their mother's people, while girls were raised for future distribution into the same cycle of captivity. In this way, the empire bred its own continuation, each generation produced by conquest feeding the next in an endless spiral of exploitation. The psychological warfare embedded in this practice was as devastating as the physical realities. Communities that saw their women bearing the children of their enemies lived in constant torment, for every child became a reminder of humiliation, and every mother a living monument of defeat. In many cultures, women marked by Mongol pregnancy could no longer return to their families, carrying both a social stigma and a biological burden that isolated them from any form of normal life. The conquerors understood this and used it ruthlessly. They transformed motherhood into a weapon, ensuring that women became the unwilling agents of their own people's destruction. To kill the men of a tribe was to end a generation. To impregnate the women was to erase an entire future. This was not warfare in the traditional sense. It was genocide by reproduction, a campaign of enforced inheritance that reshaped the human map. Thus, by the time the empire reached its zenith, the world was not only bowed under Mongol banners, but altered in its very blood. The steppes had produced conquerors before, men who raided, plundered, and enslaved, but none who had transformed the act of sexual violence into a tool of continental strategy. Genghis Khan alone elevated it into a system where ledgers tracked wombs as carefully as they tracked cavalry, where genetic domination became as important as military victory, and where the legacy of conquest would continue to echo not merely in ruins or chronicles, but in the cells of millions of living descendants. It was here, in this brutal fusion of biology and warfare, that the horror of his practices reached their most horrifying scale, ensuring that even centuries later, the shadow of his empire would still live in the blood of nations. By the twilight of Genghis Khan's reign, the machinery of sexual terror he had built had reached such a scale that it seemed less like the excesses of a single man and more like an empire whose very foundations rested upon the systematic violation of women. The Mongol military machine was no longer measured only by the number of horses it fielded or the territories it subdued, but also by the network of captivity it sustained, stretching from the steppes of Mongolia to the markets of Persia and the cities of China. Comfort houses were established along the empire's communication routes. Women were rotated between posts as though they were supplies, and entire villages were required to deliver yearly quotas of daughters to satisfy the insatiable demand of the army. This was cruelty institutionalized, its efficiency masked by the cold language of administration, and at its center stood the figure of a conqueror who had transformed his personal shame into a policy of universal degradation. The psychological weight of these practices cannot be overstated. For conquered peoples, the destruction of their men was a tragedy, but one that could be met with mourning, rituals, and perhaps eventual recovery. The violation of their women, however, left wounds that no funeral rites could close. A father who watched his daughter taken, a mother who saw her son born with the blood of an enemy, a community forced to live with generations marked by the conqueror's seed. These were torments that rippled outward across centuries. In many regions, traditions hardened into protective cages, where women were cloistered, marriages arranged at the earliest possible age, and architecture itself reshaped to conceal daughters behind walls of stone. What began as an immediate defense against Mongol predation calcified into cultural practices that long outlasted the empire, embedding fear into the very fabric of daily life. The Mongols had succeeded not only in conquering land, but in permanently altering how societies viewed women, sexuality, and survival. Yet even within this darkness, there flickered acts of defiance that history could not completely extinguish. Among the thousands of concubines trapped within the Khan's courts, whispers of rebellion circulated like hidden embers. Stories emerged of women who chose death rather than submission, of mothers who smuggled poison to their daughters, of captives who struck down their oppressors in fleeting moments of courage. The most enduring legend is that of the Tongut princess who, after years of degradation, found her chance to strike back. In the dimly lit tent of the great Khan, on a night when storms raged outside and guards were distracted, she concealed a blade within her hair and waited for the moment when his arrogance would render him most vulnerable. When that moment came, she did not hesitate. With a whisper dedicated to the family she had lost and the countless women who had suffered before her, she struck the man who had turned sexuality into a weapon, proving that even the most powerful tyrant could bleed at the hands of a victim he believed broken. Whether this account is fact, myth, or something in between hardly matters, for it captures a truth deeper than historical record, that the very system Genghis Khan had built contained within it the seeds of its own undoing. Every violated woman was a potential assassin, every enslaved daughter a reminder that domination breeds resistance. His empire, though it would continue under his descendants, carried forward with it the paradox of power. Built on terror, fear can control bodies, but it cannot entirely extinguish the will to resist. The legend of his death at the hands of a concubine spread quickly through the women's quarters of the empire, whispered in the darkness of comfort houses and brothels, carried like a secret flame from one generation to the next. It was a story that, even if embellished, offered hope that absolute power was never truly invulnerable. Centuries later, the legacy of these practices endures not only in the genetic imprint carried by millions, but in the cultural landscapes scarred by trauma. The obsession with female purity in many societies, the rise of practices such as honor killings and child marriages, the linguistic taboos surrounding sexual violence, all of these can be traced, at least in part, to the scars left by Mongol terror. The conqueror's shadow lingers not just in ruins and chronicles, but in behaviors, beliefs, and fears passed down like heirlooms of suffering. Genghis Khan reshaped the world not only through his armies, but through his horrifying manipulation of sexuality, leaving behind a legacy as intimate as it was brutal. His was an empire written in blood, but its darkest chapters were inscribed in flesh, in the bodies of women who became unwilling monuments to conquest. And though centuries have passed, the echo of their cries still lingers, reminding us that history's most horrifying sexual practices were not simply the excesses of war, but the deliberate policy of a man whose personal wound metastasized into the suffering of nations. The story of Genghis Khan is often told as a tale of military genius, of swift horses thundering across the steppes and armies that reshaped continents. But hidden beneath the victories and the empire lies a truth far more chilling. His conquest was not only of lands, but of bodies, not only of cities, but of generations. The most horrifying sexual practices ever recorded in history were not accidents of war, but deliberate strategies, born from one man's wound and institutionalized into the very structure of empire. Centuries later, the scars remain etched in bloodlines, preserved in traditions, and whispered in stories of terror that still echo across Asia. If this dark chapter of history has opened your eyes to the hidden horrors behind the legend, don't let the silence of the past continue. Share this story, subscribe for more untold truths, and join us as we uncover the darkest secrets history tried to bury.